The Age of Uncertainty podcast by Nigel Baker.
Hi everyone, welcome to the latest episode of the Age of Uncertainty podcast, and this is number 3 in this name series, New Agile Method Experiments. This one's all about looking at agile frameworks, looking at what I called the front, the back, the ceiling and the floor. So this episode actually started out on the Agile Network as what we call an exclusive event. Now these are not sort of pre-recorded webinars, these are more interactive workshops. So there was no sort of material for me to replay here. So what I've tried to do is rebuild a bit of that conversation here for you in terms of some pictures, some slideware, some animations, etc. Okay. Now what I find interesting about this is this may be the least formed of some very unformed ideas about these new Agile Method experiments. But this is really trying to get into looking at frames and just looking at, have we drawn the right lines on the playing pitch of the game that we are playing in software development? More product development, that's what this is really about. Looking at that playing pitch and working out, have we set the right dimensions and starting the conversation. Again, have I got answers for this? No, but I've got some pretty interesting questions. So we're going to take this model I've come up with, look at it, have a conversation, and then run through a couple of examples there to see if this helps us start expanding our world of work, or at least starting the right people in the industry to start talking about perhaps changing how they change the world of work. So before we start, I know all models are wrong, but some are useful, and I know a map is not the territory. So here I'm going to have a very simple 4-point model. I understand that is a huge abstraction of reality, and in fact in reality there would be many facets or angles to the model, let alone the most important aspect, which we talk about in all these videos, which will be time, making it 3-dimensional or even 4-dimensional. So depending on what angle you look at it, depends on what it actually is. I get all that. That's fine, but let's just look at a simplification and see what that can tell us. If we are to re-look at our approaches for building software, there are 4 coordinates to consider. We should discuss the start of the method, the entry point, the front door, the end of the method, the back door, how high up the organization and work the method goes, the ceiling, and how low into detail should the method reach, the floor. To use Scrum as an example, these 4 factors have evolved over time. The front. In Scrum, this consists of a product goal on top of a created set of product backlog items. Each item has a maximum size of 1 sprint, so generally days to weeks, and there's a lot of wiggle room here, but the entire concept of scoping, like requirement capture, etc., is regarded as outside the realms of this method. This is claimed to be because there are so many different approaches possible that one defined way would be artificially limiting and probably incorrect in most applications. The backdoor. In Scrum, this is the increment, along with its associated definition of done. Now that concept has been pushed hard over the years, though less so in the last decade. The ideal of incrementalism is that each increment is completed to a standard that requires no further work for the customer to use it. This has been very well defined since the early days of Scrum. The ceiling. Scrum historically has been regarded as a one-team process. Whilst the team involved has complete power to do whatever is needed to deliver the work, the idea of self-organisation meant that needs, aka the whats, were cascaded down from leadership, and this is where ceiling and front start to clash a little. Can a team be truly self-managing if the way the team receive its inputs is not incorporated into that approach? In fact, should a development team be self-managing? We spoke before about the setting of that variable being a key factor to the design of any new agile method. The other aspect with the ceiling is how that interacts with other teams. No man is an island, no woman is an island, and no team is an island. Teams need to have a collaborative relationship with each other, and there needs to be assistance in providing approaches to facilitate that. Else, we have either independent product teams as roving war bands clashing with each other, interdependent teams clashing, or having to design from scratch ad hoc approaches to cover and then gap that scenario by scenario. And with that ad hoc approach could lead to bad ideas and bad situations. So a good method needs to have a way to be gestalt. In this example of a team-based model, do we need a team of teams model first? Or do we need a model that scales? Now, to use Scrum again as an example, Scrum started as a team-based approach. A proto-scaling method was invented to allow disparate Scrum teams to work together, which was known as the Scrum of Scrums. A volunteer from each team would come together to discuss daily where their team are, where it is going, and what barriers do they have. Now, this was reported by many as insufficient, so other approaches were created. So, for a part of the Scrum community, they had the feeling that Scrum was all that was needed, and the teams tessellate nicely with additions. And by the way, if you don't know about tessellation, please go watch one of the earlier videos in this series. But we can see this is self-evident not true at the moment, as the Scrum of Scrums is an addition to this method. So some have used the term fractal to describe Scrum. They have added Scrum or Scrum-like methods to the ceiling to allow Scrum to grow. And this has been practices such as one shared product backlog, one shared product owner, shared sprint reviews, and even for some, shared sprint planning. Depending on the commercial approach, basically depends on how much these fractal ideas are used. So things like Less and Nexus use them the most, and Scrum at Scale uses far fewer. And then we have methods that add extra process and roles. Now, some of these are derived from Scrum and Agile style methods. Release trains are derived from extreme programming release practices. And some of these are new inventions or incorporated from different philosophical models. And this is the world of the pretty regarded as failed scaled Agile framework SAFe. I feel that if we are to encourage the use of a better way of working in an organisation, it cannot add extra processes and rules to take us over the sort of my conceptual limit of 5 to 15 ideas. Now, my 5 to 15 is a really rough concept I've not talked about yet in this video and these videos, but what I would like to say about it is generally there's this rule of thumb of sort of 7 ideas someone can hold in their mind, and yes, we all know the science behind it's complete cod, probably isn't true, but generally holding less things in your mind is far easier to manage than more things in your mind. So what we want to do is try and keep us in that sort of, for me, 7 plus or minus 2 idea of approaches to remember. So ideally, for me, I would want a newer approach to tessellate. Now, tessellation and gestalt could be seen in contradiction to each other. Tessellation, as I spoke about in that earlier video, was very much about atomic small pieces fitting together, and a gestalt approach is all about a bigger holistic thinking. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. But I actually don't see the conflict here though. As long as we ensure the new idea is holistic in outcomes and impacts and can be understood holistically, then we don't have to worry so much about the incremental structures. It may be that the need to tessellate is to add this requirement to the... Whoops, that's something I don't necessarily want to mention quite yet. The 3 new roles I've been experimenting with. So hold that for now. There may be some new names for some new roles out there, and I'm going to bring them up in another video. Let's just call them PM, PM, and PM for now. Now, let's investigate that further later, because now we have a subject that could be controversial. The flaw. The flaw of the method. This is the term I'm using for where the method stops in terms of details. All methods are abstractions. Most methods do not work down to the limit of human physical awareness, measuring work items in micrometers or nanoseconds, though the work may actually need to do so. Why? Because that level of detail may not be useful for the work we are accomplishing and the organisation for the delivery of that work. A carpenter would work in millimeters, a builder to perhaps centimeters. So at what level of detail do we need to set the detail we need to plan and deliver our work? We can see here, again, how the front and the floor also interact. The size and detail of items entering the front door will have a huge effect on the performance of the team. The general discovery in the world of work is that smaller work items are better than bigger work items. And having those work items being value focused, so in our world, thus features, is essential. So Scrum goes down to these product backlog items, and again, depending on the units you use, but let's just say days generally, right? With the team having the option to break it down further if they wish. Tasking, as it's called, is about breaking the work down into how the work will be done. And this is performed by the team. Maybe come up with a new name for that later. They performed by the team to a level they find useful to plan their own work and how they work together. But is this the right level currently? Are we giving the right support in how we advise this? Sprint backlog structures in Scrum have been watered down extensively over the years, leading teams to feel like they are completing paperwork and bureaucracy that offers them no value. Yet the information they capture is not useful for the business to see where it is. So to give another example of the flaw, Scrum deliberately removed engineering practices from itself before its general publication. Now, I'll be frank, I have never seen the actual practices they said they followed before they were removed, but by listening and reading some of the early blog posts by those Agile members, makes me think one of the key factors in those early Scrum teams was object orientation. This philosophy effectively built a level of unspoken planning and design in the product. So the floor was actually set quite low down. And the same is true for extreme programming and Smalltalk. There are writings on the original C2 wiki about Christopher Alexander's ideas of constructed process versus generative process, and how a process arises from the contextual factors of its environments. And that's not just technological constraints or context, but political and social. Perhaps the entire Agile movement has communicated the wrong idea. A generative process led to Scrum and extreme programming, and then a constructive process mentality led to their advocacy. The danger of this, of course, is thousands of times across thousands of businesses, people generate terrible processes and ruin their lives. So I'm not sold on that being the answer alone. Hey, let's roll our own death march. But perhaps the framework idea has been leading us that way. A thin constructed frame to lead us towards perhaps a new generative process each time within. But I would state the dislocation of that work from the planning, the separation of the two worlds, has led us to a space where agile methods seem to have very little about the team and what they actually do, which has led developers to first have a disinterest and now a vivid dislike of agile. So, should the floor change? Moving the floor lower would require extensive C2 wiki style discussion, right? I do not believe OO is the answer, let alone test-driven development. I think they are answers, but not some sort of uniform one-size-fits-all solution. And the effort required to instigate those is high and slow and long. And those three aspects will affect a new method's virality, its ability to spread in an organization. But we do need in the agile movement something to bring in the real workers, because the flaw they see is not small talk, it's not object orientation, etc., but it's effectively Jira, an encrusted layer of shit lying on top of a delicious dessert that is the code. So how do we interlace the two more? How low should we go? How low should we go? How low should we go? I'll stop that joke right now. I tend to recommend newer teams, and I just don't mean newer in terms of age, I mean newer in terms of technology, social situations, political situations, environmental situations, etc. I recommend newer teams break down their work deeper than more mature team. So should we communicate that in the method itself, rather than just be relied upon as helpful advice? Moving away from Scrum for a moment, we can apply this same method to other methods. For instance, extreme programming. if we look here at extreme programming, we can see that because it's based on Scrum, it's fundamentally Scrum, as we all know, but with a deeper flaw, with the engineering practices included in its own world. That's an interesting conversation, an interesting way to think about it. Or we could look at some monstrosity like the Scaled Agile framework, SAFe, which is trying to be everything. It's trying to cover the whole world. It's trying to cover from dawn to dusk to the moon to the center of the earth. And of course, it's really struggling because that complicated domain problem process space is incredibly hard to turn into some sort of simple, snackable approach. Or then you get the ultimate snackable approach, Kanban, which has almost, well, depending on who you're talking to about Kanban, depending whether it's capital K Kanban, small k Kanban, the Kanban method. Oh my God, let's not get into that sort of theory wars. But if we look at something like Kanban, it is so small and so slight as an approach, right? And in terms of actually how it works and what it's trying to do, that you need to add a range of other things into that space to make it function properly. Of course, the sensible people know a lot of those tools from the lean world. And if you want to look at something new, well, in terms of this video in 2025, we've got the Scrum expansion pack, which is being marketed like this, a slightly bigger version of Scrum. Will probably end up like this, some sort of SAFe-esque massive method, and probably should be something like this. Not at all an expansion of the method, but more of a source of knowledge that could be used to inspire the conversations around. I think I once used the word Scrum appendix, like the Silmarillion of the Scrum world, and I think that could be kind of useful if someone actually comes up with it. For me, and to conclude this, I definitely think this is an interesting approach that I'm going to experiment a lot more with. I think this idea of just talking about this front, back, ceiling, floor is a really interesting thing to do. And I think, for me, there is some sort of conversation we should be having about new methods. And I don't just mean adding on to what we've currently done, but thinking about those frames. Getting away from these extremists who say everything's contextual, nothing matters, but don't believe in anything. Getting away from these almost criminals who say, yeah, might is right, listen to the strong leader, we don't need self-organization, we don't need learning. Getting away from those two extremes and finding some middle ground scaffolding. Maybe it's a derivative of Scrum, maybe it's something else, but I feel we are very close to finding an interesting answer there. Would the solution solve our problems? Hell no. Their job is to help us see the problems, but perhaps something added to those in some small, simple way that could help them just work together better, help them be used more easily, help them be more snackable, help them be more consumable, help them be more valuable. What is that? I don't know. I'm still experimenting. And that's really where I am at the moment, to be honest. I'm coming to the end of the road of these new Agile Method experiments. Now, I may put together one more episode in the future, maybe talking about some of the things I only touched upon here that I've been experimenting with, like the amount of process someone can hold in their head, the 7 ± 2 number. Maybe I'll come up with some of the stuff on new names for roles, and new roles for names. That I've been experimenting with as well. I'm not sure. I don't know if I want to out that, but maybe I will. Maybe I was nothing super amazing, but maybe I'll bring that up at some point. And I'm going to pull a few more things out that I've done recently on things like the Scrum Guide expansion pack before that becomes too passé and out of date. But I hope, as always, this video's been interesting. Now, I don't know how useful it is. I'm not sure how much you can go back tomorrow and implement this in your job, but maybe as another lens to think about what we do and how we do it, perhaps this could get us out of that little mental box and expand our minds a little bit. And if you do anything with this stuff, please feed it back to me. I'd love to know if it's helping, if it's interesting, if it's thought-provoking, if it's helping move the industry on, because that's my aim these days. I am desperately trying to help people change their own worlds of work, and when no one else needs to be doing it, talking about what the future of work looks like, because it doesn't have to look like the past, it doesn't have to look like hell. It could be something pretty constructive if we learn, if we experiment, if we try, and if we share. Sorry for the speech. I do apologise. And I hope to see you again soon, maybe on the next episode of this podcast, whenever it's going to turn up. Thank you so much, everyone. Cheers.